Before we get started, we would like to recognize that while we call our home the Village, it is also unceded traditional land of the Lenape and Munsee peoples. We would like to acknowledge in this archival recording the Lenape and Munsee communities, and especially their elders, past and present, and express gratitude for their stewardship of this land, for contributing to its geography, and for the use of their language as place names. If you'd like to find out more about this, please reach out. We're happy to offer resources. So welcome. My name is Anna Markham. I am the Director of Research and Preservation at Village Preservation. We are so thrilled that you're all here with us this evening. A quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit, membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. Learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org. And if you are able, we would absolutely love it if you visited villagepreservation.org/donate and helped us out a little bit. We are thrilled to be joined today by our co-hosts for the evening, the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. The goal of the project is to broaden people's knowledge of LGBT history beyond Stonewall and to place that history in a geographical context. You can learn more at nyclgbtsites.org. And don't worry, I'll be putting these websites in the chat for your reference later on. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. Though I won't be visible during the talk, I'll be here. So please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any thoughts or issues. If you have questions for our speakers specifically, please use the Q&A function. It just helps us to keep track of them. And you can do that at any point during the talk. We plan on having a lively discussion after Sarah's finished speaking, so please send as many questions as you would like. We'll get to as many as we can. I'm so delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Sarah Schulman is the author of more than 20 works of fiction, including The Cosmopolitans, Bohemia, and Maggie Terry, nonfiction, including Stagestruck, Conflict is Not Abuse, and the Gentrification of the Mind, and theater, Carson McCullers, Manic Flight, Reaction, and more, and the producer and screenwriter of several feature films, The Owls, Mommy is Coming, and United in Anger, among others. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Slate, and many other outlets. She is a Distinguished Professor of Humanities at the College of Staten Island, a fellow at the New York Institute of Humanities, the recipient of multiple fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, and the New York Foundation of the Arts, and was presented in 2018 with Publishing Triangle's Bill Whitehead Award. She is also the co-founder of Mix New York LGBT Experimental Film and Video Festival, and the co-director of the groundbreaking Act Up Oral History Project. A lifelong New Yorker, she is a longtime activist for queer rights and women's empowerment and serves on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace. Sarah, thank you so much for being here with us, and I will turn this evening over to you.
Great, thanks for having me. I was born in 1958 on 10th Street, and I've lived on 9th Street for 40 years. So the Village is my hometown. So I'm very, very happy to be here. So my book is called Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993. And ACT UP is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, the direct action AIDS activist organization. Before I go into the founding of ACT UP, I want to start a little bit with, the beginning of AIDS, just giving you some background history. And I see, by looking at who's here, some of you know quite a bit about this. So please feel free to join in with comments, questions, disagreements, whatever you have. So we now know that AIDS has probably existed for about 100 years and probably came to the United States in the 1940s and certainly came to New York in the 1960s and 70s. But because we don't have a coherent healthcare system, the pattern was not observed by science until it entered into a certain middle-class group of gay men who had private healthcare. And that was in 1981. Now, just to create for you the picture of the historic setting, in 1981, gay men were a profoundly oppressed group. All queer people were. Gay sex was not legal. The sodomy laws were not overturned federally until 2003. In New York City, there was no gay rights bill. You could be kicked out of your apartment, you could be denied a job, or you could be refused public accommodation in a restaurant or hotel. Familial homophobia was the cultural norm and was virulent. And street violence against gay people was common practice. It was considered a form of entertainment, even in the village, especially in the village, because that's where the gay people were. People would come into the neighborhoods to gay bash. And of course, you couldn't turn to the police or to any kind of protective force. So it was a constant presence. And that was the environment into which the AIDS virus was unleashed. So the first public discussion of AIDS was July 3rd, 1981 in the New York Times. And the headline said, 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco. Now, just to decode that headline for you, in that period of profound homophobia, legal and social and familial homophobia, there were a lot of theories about what the cause of homosexuality was. Homosexuality was considered to be one thing. Now we know that sexuality and gender are different in each person. But at the time, that was not really understood. And so anti-gay views of trying to find the cause, because you never try to find the cause of something that you're neutral about. Like no one tries to figure out why people like sports, for example. But they were trying to find the cause of homosexuality. And there were a lot of theories that it was biological. And they even had like pseudoscience theories that, you know, your hypothalamus gland was the cause of your homosexuality or whatever. So when you have this headline, rare cancer found in homosexuals, it was conflated in the public's mind with the biological disease of homosexuality itself. And so at the beginning, people thought that this new terminal illness was somehow connected to homosexuality. And so the first name for this disease was gay-related immune deficiency, GRID. And then it became known as AIDS. The first 5 years of the AIDS crisis, 40,000 people died in the United States. To date, we think it's about 700,000 deaths, the same as COVID. But in those 5 years, the government did absolutely nothing. If you recall, Reagan was president. And pharmaceutical companies did nothing. They basically were trying to recycle failed cancer drugs for which they owned the patents. And what they were looking for was a drug that you would take that would make your AIDS go away. And that was not possible because AIDS is an umbrella term like cancer. It's different in each person. What it means is that your immune system is no longer working. So as your immune system deteriorates, you produce symptoms or what was called opportunistic infections. And the most common ones were pneumonia, dementia, the inability to process nutrition, blindness, swelling of nerves in your legs. And AIDS death was a terrible death, and people with AIDS suffered incredibly. So what people with AIDS really needed was treatments for each of those opportunistic infections. But pharma was not interested in pursuing that because that was a smaller market share than trying to find a drug that perhaps they already had a patent for that could be sold to the whole market of people with AIDS. Now, in those first 5 years, the gay community basically tried to create some facsimile of social services. So for example, gay men's health crisis, there was a Puerto Rican gay social worker named Diego Lopez who died of AIDS, but he started a program for GMHC called the Buddy System. And it was people would volunteer and you'd be assigned to a person with AIDS and you would just like hang out with them or help them do their shopping or whatever until they died. And because of familial homophobia, a lot of people did not have any kind of family network to fall back on. So the gay community through GMHC was trying to recreate something like that. There was an organization that would walk your dog for you. There was a group called, that still exists, God's Love, We Deliver, that brought home cooked meals to homebound people with AIDS. And that's basically how the first 5 years of Reaction went. But in 1987, so now we're like 6 years into the epidemic, things started to turn more political. And what really was the catalyst for that was that the Supreme Court ruled in the Bowers v. Hardwick decision that sodomy laws were upheld, that sodomy laws were constitutional. And this was a total slap in the face to the gay community. People had been involved in, really a mass death experience for 5 years, and the government had done nothing. And here they come along and say, yes, gay sex should be illegal. And there were very angry demonstrations in the streets in New York and in Washington, D.C., often without permits, and that really politicized people. And then right before ACT UP was founded in March of 1987, there were two smaller political events. One was that a graphics collective created a poster with a pink triangle against a Black background that had the word "silence equals death." And they took that poster and they repasted it all over the city. And then a ZAP action group. Now, ZAP actions were a tactic that came from the earlier gay liberation movement. And when you do a ZAP action, it really means that you have no desire to fit into the system, because it's really about like bursting in and ruining everything. That's kind of what it does. And so this group called the Lavender Hill Mob did a ZAP action at the CDC where they burst in wearing concentration camp uniforms and busted up the meeting. So there was more and more expression of anger. In March of 1987, the playwright and author Larry Kramer gave a speech at the Lesbian and Gay Center on 13th Street off of 6th Avenue. And the audience decided that they wanted to form a group. So a few days later, people from the audience met, and Larry also met, and that those people started a new organization, and they named it the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Now, in the next 6 years, which are the years that are covered in my book, 1987 to 1993, ACT UP won absolutely incredible victories. And I just want to tell you what some of them were so that you have a sense of what their accomplishment was. So ACT UP forced pharmaceutical companies, this is along with the rest of the AIDS activist movement broadly defined, to change the way they structured the creation of medications to focus on opportunistic infections. So they changed the way that the research was done. ACT UP forced the Food and Drug Administration to release experimental drugs, even if they hadn't been approved, to people who needed them. ACT UP, in a 4-year campaign, forced the CDC to change the definition of AIDS so that women could qualify for benefits and for experimental drug trials. And I just want to explain that one for a minute. In the 60s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, and many of them had children born without limbs. And they sued pharma, and pharma had to pay out huge settlements. So after that, they decided that women could not be in experimental drug trials. And also because of sexism, the government's official definition of what you had to have an AIDS diagnosis was based only on symptoms that men had. But women had different symptoms, and those symptoms were not on the list. So women could actually get AIDS and die and never qualify for an AIDS diagnosis, and therefore never get benefits and never get into experimental drug trials. And women with AIDS tended to be poorer, tended to be more women of color, for example, and to have worse health care and to get diagnosed later. And so the death rates were much higher. And in some ways, this victory for ACT UP was its most far-reaching, because today, every woman with HIV in the world who takes a medication is now taking something that was tested on women because of this breakthrough. ACT UP made needle exchange legal in New York City. I'm going to get back to that one later. ACT UP took on the Catholic Church. This is before the priest-sex scandal, when the Catholic Church was so powerful in this city. The cardinal was more powerful than the mayor, and he was an office longer than the mayor. And normally the Catholic Church stayed in their lane in the Catholic schools. But when condom distribution started in the public schools, the Catholic Church started getting on school boards, public school boards, to try to stop that and to try to stop needle exchange. And ACT UP did an action where we disrupted Mass in St. Patrick's Cathedral in December of 1989. And this kept the Catholic Church from being able to inhibit condom distribution in the public schools. ACT UP made HIV removed as a pre-existing condition for private insurance, which made hundreds of thousands of people suddenly eligible for private insurance. And really, most importantly, ACT UP changed the way that people with AIDS and queer people felt about ourselves and the ways that we were seen in the media. One of the most interesting interviews that I did, and I just want to say that I interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP over 18 years, was with a photojournalist named Donna Binder. And she was telling about how she would take photographs and then she would go home to her darkroom and develop them and then go to the offices of the photo editors. And they didn't want these photographs. They wanted images of people with AIDS emaciated, lying in their beds, dying. And only after ACT UP went and disrupted Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral did they finally understand that photos of people fighting for their lives were pictures of people with AIDS. And after that action, you can see the representations in mainstream magazines really changing. So, ACT UP was a coalition and it was a very complex one. And because they were so successful, I think it's really important for us to look back and think about what strategies they used that made them be so successful. So through the process of all of my interviews, I have cohered some of the key, I think, takeaways that show us why ACT UP was as effective as it was. So one thing is that ACT UP was not a consensus-based movement. By that I mean, you did not have to agree to do something. So there was a bottom line, there was a principle of unity that was one line: direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that was direct action as opposed to social service provision. So if you were going to do direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do it. So let's look at the example of needle exchange so I can show you how this non-consensus decision-making worked. Now at the time, sharing needles was one of the major ways that people got infected in New York City. And people were introducing this new concept, harm reduction. Now, at the time, the operative idea about how to deal with drug users was abstinence. But harm reduction was much more progressive. It was like, it would be nice if people were not addicted to drugs, but if they're going to be, why not give them clean needles? Because the slogan was, dead addicts can't recover. So we had a Black mayor at that point, David Dinkins, and the Black community was very ambivalent about needle exchange. And many people in ACT UP were very ambivalent about needle exchange. So when the Needle Exchange Committee came into being, there were people in ACT UP who didn't agree with that strategy. Now, if a proposal came to the floor, we would argue. And this was a pre-gentrification New York, right? It was like a very Jewishy, Italian, Puerto Rican kind of place, and lots of arguing. And but in the end, if you didn't want to do needle exchange, you just wouldn't do it. You wouldn't try to stop the people who wanted to do it from doing it. And that was really ACT UP's strength, that it was radical democracy. So if I didn't want to do something and you were going to do it, I just wouldn't do it. I would find my own people to do the project that I wanted to do. And as a result, there was a simultaneity of action in which so many different kinds of campaigns were being run at the same time in so many different social strata, with so many different aesthetics and so many different approaches, that that's really what created the paradigm shift. And it's a great lesson for us today, where there's a lot of push towards homogeneity in politics. Today, there's a trend towards everybody using the same words, everybody agreeing, people wanting to get everyone to agree. But I think historically, Movements that try to force agreement of analysis and agreement of strategy have always failed, and I don't think there's an exception to that. So this kind of radical democracy with big tent politics, where you have a bottom line, but really people are free to act from where they're at, are the most effective, because people can only be where they're at. And I wish that that wasn't true, but it is true. So if you facilitate people being effective from where they're at, you really get somewhere. And ACT UP was effective. And the reason it was effective was because it practiced ideas that it had learned from the previous feminist movement about patient-centered politics. In the years before, now the older men in ACT UP had been in gay liberation, but many of the younger gay men had not been politically active. And women tended to have come from the previous feminist movement and had a lot more political experience. And the feminist women's health movement really had patient-centered politics because they were dealing in the 60s and 70s with a completely male-controlled medical field. And they learned that you determine how to go forward by looking at it from the point of view of the patient. And people like Risa Denenberg and Marion Bonsoff and Maxine Wolf, who had come from those earlier movements, literally brought those ideas to ACT UP through a series of teach-ins. Now, ACT UP did not have leaders. They did not have spokespeople. Any person could be a spokesperson. So the rank and file was highly educated and highly sophisticated to the issues through this series of teach-ins. And that's how this idea of patient-centered politics came in. So if you look at things from the point of view of people with AIDS, then you see that the clock is ticking and people are dying and people have real needs. They need treatment for this. They need access to insurance. They need housing. And so that need, that immediate need, is what made ACT UP effective. And so there was no empty theoretical discussion. One of the leaders, Maxine Wolf, said that you pick your action and then your theory will emerge. Because once you know your action, you have to make decisions. And those decisions will cohere your values. But if you're arguing about theory and there's no application, you're just going to get polarized and you create a bureaucracy, and then you can't be effective. And there was very little control in ACT UP. Like I remember someone in the front of the room saying, we need someone to write a letter to this commissioner. And someone would say, I'll do it. And then they would just do it. Like nobody would like read the letter and say, we need a comma here, or can't we change this word? You just let people do what they needed to do because we needed to move forward. And being effective was very important. In that vein, it's interesting that it was a white gay male majority organization, but there was significant participation by women and some people of color, particularly Latinos. And women and people of color in ACT UP never stopped the action to demand consciousness raising about racism or sexism. What they did instead was they had their own agendas for their constituencies, and they kept their eyes on the prize and marshaled the ample resources of the organization. So here's an example. ACT UP had an art auction that raised $650,000. Every major artist contributed something, and the people who organized it are now running museums like the Hammer Museum and the Warhol Museum. So they were already plugged into the art world. So when the Latino caucus realized that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico really needed support, they could just go to the fundraising committee and say, we need money to go to Puerto Rico to start ACT UP Puerto Rico. They didn't have to raise the money themselves. And similarly were the women. When HIV positive women needed money to travel, to testify at hearings, and they needed places to stay, like in Washington, D.C. or something like that, the money came from the fundraising committee. So the more lower income communities inside ACT UP did not have to raise their own money. And so they just like knew what they wanted and ran their campaigns. And that's how they won things for their constituencies, which is really interesting. And I want to talk a little bit about the, I see time is going very quickly here. I want to talk a little bit about how the coalition inside ACT UP worked and what its strengths and weaknesses were. So there were some people in ACT UP who were very, very elite. There were, like Larry Kramer had gone to Yale with the head of Bristol Myers Pharmaceutical Company, right? So he could call him and get a meeting. And there were people who went to Harvard, or people who had been a stockbroker or something like that. And in the 80s, the whole government was white and male. The entire media was white and male, and the whole private sector was white and male. Even me as a white lesbian, there was no one who looked like me in any of the power apparatus. You know, there was no Tammy Baldwin, there was no Rachel Maddow, there was none of that. So when these guys would sit down with those guys, there was an identification. And they were able to get access, and they were able to relate to each other in a certain way. But when the Women's Committee, who was fighting to change the definition so women with AIDS could get benefits, it took them 2 years to be able to get a meeting with Fauci. Now, Fauci was still the man back then. And, you know, the men were working with Fauci, and the women couldn't get in to see Fauci, and the men didn't help the women get in to see Fauci. And when they finally got in, he just revealed that he really had disdain for them, you know, so they had a very different kind of experience. And the way they got in was not by making a phone call to someone that you went to Yale with. They got in by screaming and yelling at people at airports and breaking into offices and doing all kinds of civil disobedience, because, you know, that was the only way they could get access, was to force it. Then take a look at the drug users. The active and former drug users who were fighting for needle exchange. They were the messiest of them all. You know, 2 people died of ODs in ACT UP. Somebody stole $10,000 from the organization. But their strategy was that to make needle exchange legal in New York City, they were going to illegally give out clean needles, get arrested, have a trial, and argue a necessity defense and hopefully win. Now, this is a very high risk strategy, right? So what you see is that within the same organization, different constituencies had different levels of access. And what it shows us today is that you have to, it's your social position that determines your playbook. And you have to be realistic about where you're really positioned, and therefore what strategies you have to use to get access to power. And the more disenfranchised you are, the messier it's going to be. And ACT UP was messy, but it's interesting the way they handled it. And I'll give you an example. So when ACT UP decided that they were going to do an action at St. Patrick's Cathedral to disrupt Mass, right? Because the Catholic Church was interfering with needle exchange and condom distribution. Now, ACT UP, I think, was mostly Catholic and Jewish, but there was a significant sort of WASP component. And that group, I think, was very concerned about ACT UP looking like an anti-Catholic organization. But the Catholics and Jews were not worried about that. But as a result of people's concerns, the decision was made that the action was going to be to go into the church on that Sunday during Mass and then do a silent die-in in the halls of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And I went too, and we all went in. Outside, there were 7,000 people. That was ACT UP's largest demonstration. Inside, people went in, and there's supposed to be a silent die-in. But one member, Michael Petrellis, just was so overcome that he jumped up on a pew and he blew a whistle and he started screaming at Cardinal O'Connor, "You're killing us," in his New Jersey accent. "You're killing us. Stop it. Stop it." And like there was chaos, total chaos. The police swarmed in, people were screaming. I mean, it was good. People got arrested. It was totally chaotic. Okay, so after that, I thought, oh my God, this is so terrible. How could he go against the group? Well, after every big action, there'd be a post-action meeting. And at the post-action meeting, people realized that this story, homosexuals with AIDS disrupt Mass. You have to imagine in 1989, that was like an impossibility. This story had been on the front page of newspapers all over the world. It was on the front page in Turkey. It was like the biggest thing ACT UP had ever done. And it completely changed our position because, as Larry Kramer famously said, they're afraid of us now. Anyway, at that meeting, people were angry at Michael for what he had done, but nobody suggested kicking him out. Nobody got kicked out Because in order to kick people out or shun people or exclude people, you have to have supremacy ideology about yourself. You have to think, oh, I'm clean, I'm pure, I'm good. This person is bad and I'm going to kick them out. But you're talking about gay people with AIDS at a time when homosexuality itself was illegal, and which we had no protections. We had no, we were the bottom. So we didn't have that concept of kicking people out. And that's an interesting, years later when I interviewed Michael, I asked him, why did you do that actually? And he said that he had felt bad because no one would let him be in their affinity group. And he was mad. So it was a very human acting out thing. And there was a lot of acting out because, we were all very young. Most people in ACT UP were in their 20s and watching each other die and watching each other suffer and go blind and go into dementia, and nobody cared. And it was a very intense experience. So in a way, the organization accounted for that. And I think that that's something that we can learn from. So I think that's my presentation. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments, your memories, and your questions. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. That was phenomenal. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our audience does too. Please submit Q&As either through the chat or the Q&A feature. And I'll be sure to relay that information to Sarah. But I'm gonna kick things off with a little bit of a question. A lot of times you've talked about, throughout the course of this talk, talked about how effective the organization of ACT UP was in creating substantial change. In your book, did you set out to sort of lay out a framework for contemporary social change organizations to be more impactful?
In fact, I'm going to show you my book right here. Let the record show. And as you can see, it's 750 pages.
Yeah.
The goal of the book is not nostalgia. The goal is to cohere activist strategies for people today to consider. Mm-hmm. I'm not telling anyone to imitate what ACT UP did or anything like that, but I think it's worth thinking about. And it's very hard to get this information. It's extremely difficult to find out how activist movements worked, because usually the mainstream media reporting on it is so distorted. And what's interesting in terms of the reporting on ACT UP itself, at the time, like I said, the media was all white and male. Well, those are the only people they ever interviewed. When you look at mainstream coverage, they're always bringing the microphone to the white male. But ACT UP had its own video artists inside who were creating their own media. And that media is really inclusive. If people are interested, they can look at the film United in Anger, which is available for free on YouTube. It's a feature documentary made by Jim Hubbard, and it uses footage that was shot by ACT UP video activists. Because just to give you a little bit of history of that, the camcorder, the mobile video camera, was the new technology at the time. It was kind of like what social media is for us now. And every movement has to use the technology of its moment and find a way to command it. And so ACT UP invented video activism. You have to remember that this movement existed before the internet. There was no YouTube, there was no email. We had video cassettes that would be mailed to people through snail mail all over the world, and that's how we communicated.
That's amazing. And as of the organization globally, or particularly within the United States, it's just, the network is really impressive. And
there were 148 ACT UPs all over the world, but don't forget that there was a pre-existing global gay community that was completely underground, but there were gay and feminist newspapers in almost every major city, sometimes more than one of each, because the mainstream media ignored us, so we had our own press, and that also really helped people communicate.
You mentioned that the privatization of the American healthcare system is part of the reason why HIV/AIDS wasn't caught sooner as something that, you know, we should be concerned about. Are there any models in other countries that you felt did a better job of that? Like what would you say?
No, AIDS was identified here first, but I interviewed one of the interesting people that I interviewed, Betty Williams, was a Quaker who worked with homeless people. And she had observed prior to science seeing AIDS that homeless people talked about something called junkie pneumonia, which was that they observed among themselves that drug addicts got a weird, strange pneumonia and died. They also had a disease that they called the dwindles, which we now realize was wasting syndrome. So in other words, these symptoms were so prevalent that there was actually language for them among the underclass. And yet, because people don't have health care, the patterns were not observed.
The American healthcare system, man.
Well, it's interesting to compare, you know, one of the really frustrating things looking at COVID is, you know, in 1996, when the good drugs for AIDS were first made available, pharma was so greedy, right, that you couldn't get them if you lived in the wrong state, or you didn't have the right insurance, or you lived in a country that couldn't afford them. And we're seeing the same thing with the COVID vaccine, that there are countries in the world who cannot get the COVID vaccine, who have 3% vaccination rates, while our stock is rotting here. So, you know, that has not changed. The greed of international pharma and the hogging of medications by the class that can afford healthcare is remarkably consistent.
As of with ACT UP, your book particularly covers up until 1993. What happened with ACT UP following that? How involved were they in further treatments that were developed? Because at least as far as I've seen, there have been a great deal of developments in recent years. So what has their role in that been?
So ACT UP had a split in 1992 where 12 people who were key people left. And why they left is a very controversial question, which I go into in great depth. But one of the reasons is that they wanted to take money from pharmaceutical companies, and they had a trajectory that they wanted to go on that put them in conflict with the vast majority of the membership. But this really was demoralizing to ACT UP, and it kind of dissipated after that. And there was like one more year, but from about 92 to 96, there were no new medications. So many people died in that period, and it was very, very depressing. And the movement kind of dissipated. 96 is when you get the good drugs. And ACT UP does still technically exist, but its height was really until about 93. 99 is the internet revolution, and ACT UP's materials were not digitized. So in 99, if you searched ACT UP, you would find almost nothing. It almost disappeared off the face of the earth. And that's why Jim Hubbard and I in 2001 founded the ACT UP Oral History Project, which people can go to at actuporalhistory.org. And that's where we have made available open access it's 188 interviews that we did over 14 years. And we've had over 18 years, we've had 14 million hits on this site. And you can download the transcripts of each interview for free. And we've had 650,000 downloads. So many people around the world are using that site.
It's a phenomenal site. I am one of those downloads. It is a wonderful repository and just phenomenal source of information of life at that time and everything that was going on. If you could let us, how did you become involved with the ACT UP movement?
Okay, so as I said, there was this very large but completely underground gay and feminist journalist milieu, and I was one of those people at age 21. I was writing for a large number of feminist and left and queer newspapers for free. And we were all out there desperately trying to figure out what was happening and reporting for our community because we had no coverage in the mainstream media. And when I first started in 1979, the main issue that I was covering in New York was that there was no gay rights bill. And this was really frustrating to the gay community here. So Ed Koch was the mayor. He was a closeted gay man, and he was an enemy of the gay community. And I was going to press conferences and saying, Sarah Schulman, New York native, Mayor Koch, why don't we have a gay rights bill? And then AIDS starts in 81. Well, I mean, it's identified in 81. And so I just started covering the stories. And I covered two different kinds of stories. Pediatric AIDS was huge in New York. A lot of people were born HIV positive. Today, because of medications, no one in the United States is born HIV positive anymore. But that was a big issue. I covered women being excluded from experimental drug trials. I covered homeless people and AIDS. So I covered it from a social justice perspective. But I also covered things like when the health department shut down the gay male bathhouses. And it's really interesting that I got that assignment because women weren't allowed in bathhouses, and I'd never been in a bathhouse. And it kind of shows you how chaotic everything was. Editors were dying. My editor at the Village Voice, Robert Massa, died of AIDS. He gave me an edit from his home in his pajamas because he was so sick. Journalists were dying. Nobody knew what the stories were. We were all overwhelmed. The mainstream press was not covering it. And they were just like, Sarah, go to cover the bathhouse closings. So I covered that. So by the time ACT UP was founded in March of 87, I'd already been writing about AIDS for about 5 years. And I joined in July of 87, and I stayed till about late 92.
We have some questions in the Q&A. What similarities do you see today between youth movements currently, either for climate or other issues? What do you see any similarities there in their organization?
Well, the similarities is that most people always want change. Right now, there's huge numbers of people in this country who desperately need change and need big structural change. Very large numbers. Around AIDS, it was a different situation. It's funny because like COVID, for example, is a collective public experience. Like, it's discussed on TV and everyone talks about it. AIDS was like our private nightmare, and our fight was to get it into the public, and that's a very different kind of thing. But there's a lot of different communities, and there's a lot of people in struggle right now, whether it's movement for Black lives, movement against police violence, refugees, the fact that no one in this whole country can afford rent and people don't have a place to live, the complete failure of our healthcare system. There's so much at stake that most people could be involved in a movement for progressive change right now. One of the things that's really different is that we have some radical young people of color in government, and they are very smart. And even though there's not a lot of them, they've really been able to make an impact. And these people, like AOC, even 10 years ago, would have been some marginalized leftist community leader. So this is a big change, and how movements are going to work with those people is something I have a lot of question about. One thing that doesn't change is that we never can get a good mayor in New York, and I'm very upset about where we're going in that regard. So there I have no illusions.
It's a real shame, unfortunately. Another question that we have is, do you think that it's possible that big pharma might take advantage of the consumer activism to get certain approvals, such as, for instance, the recent approval of a dubious
Alzheimer's drug?
Alzheimer's, yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think that we realized at the time that we were opening the door for pharma to get away with something. And right now, it's absolutely true that things can get approved that shouldn't be approved. That is for sure.
Another question was similar from Timothy about that. So, okay. Any other questions, audience? Do we have any big Q&A, any comments, questions, concerns?
Or personal experiences that you want to share? Somebody here said that he had a great buddy at GMHC, Shep.
Well,
Do you want to tell us about that?
Hugh, can we promote, we could promote that person to panelists possibly?
Hi, yeah, we can absolutely promote to panelists if you would like to speak. However, we don't want to put anyone on the spot. If
Oh
you
yeah,
wanna
we're not
share.
putting you on the
However,
spot.
Shep is not
Yeah.
shy. I know him. He was in ACT UP. He can
Oh,
tell us
yay.
about his experience being a buddy.
Uh-huh. Well, we would love to have you share if you're willing.
Turn on your camera.
Yeah, if you'd like to, then we can certainly just let us know in the
Okay.
chat, direct message any of us.
Okay.
Amazing. I know that there was a huge visual arts component to ACT UP. How effective do you think that was in creating further awareness and bringing in some more attention to the cause?
Extremely important. I mean, first of all, this was New York. So it was the cutting edge of advertising and graphic design. This was pre-assimilation gay people. This is before the banality of the rainbow flag and all of that, when gay people were really on the cutting edge of creating new aesthetic ideas for the world. And in my book, I have a 150-page section on art and ACT UP. So we had incredible visuals that use the tricks of advertising to convey ideas about AIDS. And also ACT UP was a political movement. It was not a not-for-profit, or it did not have a 501c3 in the years that I'm covering. And so it raised its money from the community. And one of the main ways was through t-shirts. ACT UP had incredible t-shirts, and in the first day that they went on sale, they made $30,000 in t-shirts. And when other chapters would start, New York would send them t-shirts that they could sell to start getting money to get things going. So getting those visual images out in the world, it really did a lot of the front work for the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Well, we have Shep promoted to panelist. If you'd like to turn your camera on, that would be great.
Oh, camera. Where's the camera?
It should be at the bottom right by where the microphone is. There's mute, and then to the right of that is video.
I'm doing it. I'm on an iPhone. I can't find it.
Oh, okay. Well,
Oh.
you can just speak. That's just fine.
Okay. So when I got to the hospital, exactly like Sarah said, I was in the hospital during that period when there were no new drugs.
Mhm.
And so I was in the hospital for like 15 weeks and with AIDS and also with sepsis. It was a horrible thing. But then I got a buddy from GMHC. His name was John, and he was a brother. That's a Catholic order, very gay though. And he was really helpful, bringing me back into the world, and because I became an amputee, and I really needed this guy. The sad thing was when he was assigned to me, they told him not to get too close to me because I only had 6 weeks to live. My doctors told me I had 6 months. And I had to wait, like Sarah said, from 94 to 96 with practically nothing until the drugs came. So it was it was touch and go. But
so GMHC was there for you.
Right. And you know, the whole community, you know, the gay community is messed up in many ways. But for me, really, people like Sarah and Ann Northrop and Larry Kramer really did, their activism really honestly saved my life. You know, I'm eternally grateful. I get choked up just thinking of it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Oh, also, I was at the first ACT UP demo in March 1987.
That's, yeah. Do you want to tell us about it?
Well, I don't even know how I found out about it. We didn't have an internet, but we all knew. People told people you had to be down there, and I went down there, and it was pretty overwhelming. Unfortunately, I had an older friend who told me, "Don't lie down and play dead and get arrested." Worst mistake of my life. I should have done it. That's what my heart told me to do. He told me not to.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chef.
Sure.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Okay. Oh.
Thank you so much
Okay.
for sharing your experience, Shep. We are so happy to have heard from you, and we really appreciate it. Thank you. Sarah, what are, in the course of your work through the oral history project, what has been the most surprising thing that you have learned from talking to so many people involved with?
Well, just like everyone else in ACT UP, I thought that what me and my friends did was ACT UP, because nobody had an organizational overview. There was no internet. You just knew what you knew. You went to the actions that you went to. You talked to the people that you knew. But other people were doing the same thing at the same time. And only when Jim Hubbard and I started interviewing people systematically did we start to realize how actually complex the organization was. And there were so many actions going on, and there were so many campaigns that no one was aware of everything. And so accruing all that information was really important. Figuring out a timeline. There was an existing timeline, but it did not include women. So getting women into the timeline and figuring that out, figuring out how the organization was structured, all of that took 2 decades really for me and Jim Hubbard to organize. When I sat down to write the book, I realized right away that it could not be chronological, that would not be accurate, because so many things happened at the same time. So fortunately, because I'm a novelist primarily, I had a lot of experience working in different kinds of storytelling forms. And so I was able to create a horizontal format because you can see, I always think that the form of a work should come organically from the content. Yes. And in this case, this horizontal structure was necessary. So when you read the book, you read about a few key actions, you read about some themes that are coherent, you read about certain strategies, and it should resonate together and create a coherent whole in your mind as you read through. And the material dictated that.
That's amazing. And also, throughout the course of this conversation, I of course was aware of the ACT UP chapter in New York, but I thought that it was just located in New York for primarily. So how did sort of like the establishment of other chapters really take place, since the organization was primarily decentralized?
It was spontaneous. We never tried to create other chapters. People created them. And whenever like an active demonstration would be shown on television, it gave queer people and people with AIDS information that there was something that they could do too. But then there were even more complex ways. Like, for example, ACT UP started, there was still apartheid in South Africa. And there was an exile from South Africa, Mark Visser, who was in ACT UP New York. When apartheid officially ended, he returned to South Africa and he brought a lot of those strategies with him. Because, in pre-internet, like the way you brought an idea was like you had to go and talk to somebody.
Yes.
Share it with them. And of course, ACT UPs were in different countries and they all had different trajectories and different cities. San Francisco was much friendlier to the gay community and people with AIDS were treated much better in San Francisco. New York was a disaster. The hospitals were a mess. People were dying in the hallways, literally. There were not enough rooms for people with AIDS. They would put people on a gurney, put the gurney in the hallway, and then tape a piece of paper on the wall that said H3, hallway 3, and that was their room. I mean, it was ridiculous. A friend of mine died in San Francisco. When he went into the emergency room, they had a special triage system so people with AIDS could enter more quickly. He got to ride the buses for free because he had AIDS. I mean, when he left the hospital, they called him to find out how he was doing. It was a completely different system. So the culture from coast to coast was really different, and in small towns was really different.
With the response by the medical establishment in New York, I've read things in the past about certain people being unwilling to or nervous about treating HIV/AIDS patients because they weren't 100% sure of how the transmission. So
at the beginning, there were stories that nurses or orderlies did not want to bring food into people's rooms. They would leave the food trays outside of the door. But it's interesting, if you talk to nurses, I'm 63, so if you talk to nurses who are my age, in New York today, they started probably around like the 80s. And many of those people have told me that, and many people were driven out of the profession because they couldn't take it. And the people who made it through that period were the most committed.
Yes, yes. Do you think that it was a similar sort of overwhelming of the system akin to what we saw with COVID-19? Or was there just less attention put on it because it was happening?
Well, the hospitals have never been adequate in New York, right? So every time that there's, and this is one of the similarities between COVID and AIDS, is that every time there's a cataclysm in this country, it immediately reveals the fissures of the society, primarily racism and economic inequality. So, the hospitals were overwhelmed, but also there was so much hostility towards people with AIDS. And in the beginning years, people did not know how it was transmitted. So there was that element as well.
It's, we're so grateful to have this history of ACT UP and to use that as an amazing source text for organizing going forward. And it's really a wonderful repository for all of this experience and information. And, we thank you so much for all of the hard work and insight that you have put into this book. We're closing in on 7 o'clock now. And so if nobody else has any questions, I think that, we will bid you guys a good night, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you all so much. Also, the link, I'll put the link to buy the book in the chat once more, just in case you guys didn't go ahead and snag your copy. Hold on one moment. Of course, I did not do that as smoothly as I would like, but buy the book, please. I know that Village Preservation will be wanting to snag a copy for our research library. But thank you so much for taking the time, Sarah. We really appreciate it.
Sure, I enjoyed it. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you all. Good night.